Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event with Jill Lepore. This is one of the most talked about books of the fall. Yeah, who's excited for this event? Who's excited? This is one of the most talked about books of the fall, and we are thrilled to have her here. We have an extraordinary fall season lined up, complete with artists and novelists and historians and politicians. Last week, we hosted Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And later this season, we're hosting Congressman Jim Clyburn. We sincerely hope that you will join us for more events. But tickets are selling fast. They really are selling very fast. So please do register, which you can do through our webpage, freelibraryfoundation.org. I want to say just a few quick words about our organization in general. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, of course, we are reliant upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can also do through our website. Again, that's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. I'd like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our media partner. And finally, I would like to thank the volunteers, a dedicated group of library patrons whose loyalty to this program is unmatched. You would have seen them as you came in the auditorium this evening. We are so grateful for their support. And now I'm going to turn things over to Toby Dichter, a member of the Foundation's Board of Directors and a tireless supporter of the Free Library and the author series. Toby generously endowed this lecture in honor of her mother, Melia Gordon. Without her support, tonight's program and much else would not be possible. Thank you all again for being here. Please join me in welcoming Toby Dichter. Toby.
How about that? So what's the secret sauce of Jill Lepore? How does this professor of both law and history, staff writer for The New Yorker for 20 years, author of countless books and prizes, wife, mother, cheerful commentator, pull us all together in thinking about the past? I think her genius lies in three things. The one, her genuine enthusiasm for the subject. She calls history the great time machine. Two, her sense of fairness, or as she calls it, the asymmetry of history, the imbalance when the story is told by those with power. She ferrets out the backstory of the forgotten characters, as she did in the life and opinions of Jane Franklin, and in the defeated Native American tribes in King Philip's War, and about in the 1741 slave rebellion in New York burning. The third is that she's a storyteller and knows how to grab the piece that will make the past come alive for us, as she does in this book with Justice Scalia, or in The History of Feminism as in The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which she introduced on this very stage in 2014, and even previous to that, her earlier books. She thinks this is the third or fourth time she's been here. So do you want to know the history of this Wonder Woman? Jill Lepore was the first in her family to go to college. A teenager who had no interest in college, but went after receiving an ROTC scholarship to Tufts University. Tufts University. You went there? I think Joe Neubauer went there. A teenager who had no interest in college, and she began as a math major. After a year, she dropped both ROTC and math and switched to English, finishing her degree at Tufts in 3 years, while working as a secretary at Harvard, where she sneaked in to audit history classes. Can you believe it? After earning her PhD from Yale, she held professorships at the University of California, San Diego, and Boston University before returning to Harvard to lead the department that she had sneaked in to audit. It's so poignant. Most relevant tonight is her founding and leading the amendment project that gave rise to this book. I love what Daniel posted on our website about it. At a time when the Constitution's vulnerability is all too evident and the risk of political violence is all too real, we the people, with its shimmering prose and pioneering research, hints at the prospects of a better constitutional future as an amended America. You should get this book, even if you've read the cover story in The Atlantic, or read the New York Times, or watched last week's PBS Evening News or CNN, because to quote Lepore about her style of narrative nonfiction, she won't give you the argument on the first page, but will convince you that you need to read the whole book to find out what happened. So let's find out, and welcome the remarkable Jill Lepore in conversation with Kate Shaw, another force of nature, professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, and I think some of her students are here, co-host of the Supreme Court podcast called Strict Scrutiny, and a contributing opinion writer with the New York Times. We are in for a treat. Please welcome Professors Kate Shaw and Jill Lepore.
Well, good evening, Philadelphia. What a pleasure it is to be here tonight in the place the Constitution first emerged to discuss this wonderful new book, We the People, by historian Jill Lepore. So, Jill, I want to start by asking you to read from the beginning of the book.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's such a treat to be here, even on this rainy day. Happy almost 250th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Constitution. Just getting you guys warmed up. Okay. Thank you so much, Kate. We, the people. The Constitution of the United States is made of things that are born, live, thrive, decay, and die. Insects, animals, plants, ideas. In order to form a more perfect union. Each of its elements began long ago in the loamy earth, hatching and creeping or slipping, slick and squealing from the womb of the mind. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. The text is written on parchment, made from sheep, fleeced, their hides soaked in lime, stretched and dried. Provide for the common defense. The ink came from the buds of oak leaves, swollen to the size of musket balls by the eggs of wasps. Promote the general welfare. Its words were shaped by quills fashioned from the feathers of molting geese. Secure the blessings of liberty. Its lofty, momentous ideas came from the minds of men long since dead and from the books they read. To ourselves and our posterity. Of the nearly 200 written constitutions, the Constitution of the United States, the most influential constitution in the world, is also among the oldest, a relic, as brittle as bone, as hard as stone. Do ordain and establish.
Yeah. So, as that opening just so beautifully distills, the book develops an argument that the Constitution is an organic being, that the documented, drafted in 1787, right here, was really just a start, and that it was intended to be subject to regular amendment, but that at various periods in our history, including in this moment, we have strayed from that essential truth. And if amendment is central to the Constitution, the degree to which the prospect of amendment feels out of reach today throws into question the entire constitutional project. So the book has tons in it. I want to cover as much as we can in the limited time we have tonight. So I'll ask a handful of questions, and then we'll have an opportunity for audience questions as well. So maybe let's start with mechanics. So Article 5 sets forth the process or processes for amending the Constitution. So can you talk a little bit about what is in Article 5, what we know about why Article 5 was included and shaped the way it was in the Constitution, and in general terms, how we have used Article 5. We'll obviously go deeper on some specifics, but just to start, give us the picture.
Yeah, sure. So Article 5 is the amendment provision of the U.S. Constitution. It's meant to work, allowing for a couple of different methods for proposing amendments to the Constitution, and then methods for ratifying the U.S. Constitution. And the methods that have been used chiefly involve Congress proposing amendments that then have to pass a supermajority in both houses of Congress, after which the proposed amendment goes to the states for ratification, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. There are other methods. The states can petition Congress to propose amendments, and if then they pass Congress, they go back to the states for ratification. The states can call for a constitutional convention to propose and deliberate over amendments, and which then still need to be ratified. None of those other methods have never actually succeeded.
So in terms of what we've actually done, supermajorities in each house of Congress, supermajorities in the states. And, you know, this is something I'm sort of fixated on. The Constitution has a few places where it imposes these very high bars. So convicting on impeachment, right, requires a conviction of 2/3 in the Senate. The 25th Amendment, the part of it that allows the vice president and the cabinet to oust a president who is unable to perform the office, but if the president objects, then 2/3 of each house of Congress has to override the president's effort to hold on. I'm thinking about presidency a lot recently, but it's a handful of places and important ones where the choice is made, sometimes in the original document and sometimes in amendments, to require significantly more than a simple majority vote. So I guess I'm curious as to Article 5 in particular. Why make it so difficult to amend the written Constitution? And how do we understand those supermajority requirements today? And maybe I'll sort of pair that with another question, because you mentioned the state constitution, right? So the US Constitution is the subject of the book, but obviously every state also has its own constitution. Many of them predate the United States Constitution. They loomed, some of them, very large in decisions made about what to do with the United States Constitution, and they're all a heck of a lot easier to amend than the federal Constitution. So I guess maybe talking about that question of difficulty in Article 5 in the context of other kind of paths not taken in terms of state constitutions, how should we think about those requirements today?
Yeah, I think we really should not think about the U.S. Constitution without the context of the state constitutions, in that I think in law schools in particular, which is mainly where people talk about the Constitution, I think those things are quite distinct, right? When people are talking about constitutional law, they're largely talking about the U.S. Constitution. But the U.S. Constitution is a product of state constitutionalism. So in 1776, before Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence in June and July of that year, the states were already writing their constitutions. Because if you think about it, the war starts in 1775. Once the war starts, the royal governors start fleeing, going back to England. The colonial assemblies collapse because they were appointed by the royal governor. A lot of the colonial assemblies, those people were loyalists. They too are turning tail and leaving for England. There's no government in the colonies anymore. And so by January of 1776, the Continental Congress starts saying, okay, hey, states, turns out you probably need a government if we're going to act in concert to continue the war. Like, you can't even muster troops, and your state's being invaded. So the states start writing constitutions in January of 1776. And John Adams gets very upset because he's like, these things need to happen in order. Every state needs to write a constitution, then we need to declare independence, then we need to write a constitution for the new nation. And the rest of the Continental Congress is like, dude, we're at war. Like, you might like to do things in that order, but that's not how they're going to happen. So it's just kind of this chaos of Pennsylvania writes its first constitution that spring. But the states, even though they are in the midst of war, people are fighting this war because they believe in self-government. And they haven't had it. So they have to invent it. And the way they're inventing it is in each of their constitutions as a different experiment. It's like a science experiment, right? We're going to run, we're going to put blue dye in this petri dish and green dye in this petri dish, and this will be our control group, and this one will, And so every state has, Pennsylvania's first constitution, you guys probably know this. I think there's no governor. The laws have to be posted in every pub in the state for a year before anyone can vote on. There's a lot of drinking going on in Pennsylvania, I think. But each state has a different way of doing things because they're just trying to figure it out. In some states you elect the judges, in some states they get appointed by the governor. Pennsylvania is a unicameral. There's only one branch of the legislature. So no, briefly. At the beginning, and then that gets immediately overruled. Pennsylvania has the most democratic constitution, and it's the one that the framers of the U.S. Constitution most want to leave behind. So there are all these different experiments, and one thing that's not working are the Articles of Confederation. I feel very silly talking to you. You're this esteemed constitutional lawyer, and so you correct me when I get things wrong. So the Articles of Confederation, which are the only thing holding the Union together for the sake of fighting the war, require unanimity to amend. All 13 states have to agree. And yet the articles are quite weak because they were just sort of thrown together. They don't grant Congress the power to tax, to resolve debts, to resolve disputes between the states. So Congress is sort of useless, which might seem very familiar. But then someone thought maybe we ought to do something about that. And so in 1786, they decide to hold a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, and sadly, no one shows up. This is going to be in Annapolis, so the few people who do show up say, no, let's meet in Philadelphia. We'll meet in Philadelphia the next year, and we're done with revising these useless Articles of Confederation. We're going to write a whole new constitution. So everybody understood from the beginning that the Constitution was going to have a good, usable, useful amendment mechanism, because the reason they were meeting was because the Articles of Confederation had a useless one. And the states by now have not all of them, but most of them have written amendment provisions into their state constitutions. So in a way, when they meet in Philadelphia, they come here in May, early May, and writing Article 5, there's a reason it's Article 5. It's kind of one of the last things they do because everything else is harder. And they're like, okay, we all agree about this one. We know we need to have an amendment provision. It's got to be not requiring unanimity. It shouldn't also be super easy. I mean, we don't want to make it like a basic majority vote or something. But the distance in between those two, how they get to 2/3, that's actually about other compromises that they've already made. But it's sort of like the no-brainer part of the Constitution in some way. And it's also, when are we now? September 24th? It's still pretty warm down here. They were so hot.
Yes. The windows are all closed,
They
right, to
nailed
keep
the
things
windows
secret.
shut.
They're so hot. It smells
They're
terrible.
so hot. They have woolen underwear on. They've spent the whole summer in Philadelphia, not going to the beach. There's no air conditioning. They have the windows now. They just want to go home. So they kind of just throw it together.
And here we are. Okay, so we talked, one of the many things the book does that's amazing, I think, is to remind us how central state constitutions are to the entirety of the United States Constitution. And another thing it does is really self-consciously expand the historical record when we study the Constitution, and in particular, of course, the topic of amendment, which is the topic of the book. So there have been, as the book shows, efforts from the beginning to amend the Constitution. And some of those efforts have created the sorts of historical records that are easy to access. But many, many more efforts to amend the Constitution that this book surfaces for the first time don't even result in a document introduced in Congress. You find them elsewhere. And so before the writing of the book, right, came this enormous project of amassing thousands, right, of new documents as part of this amendments project. So Jill, can you just talk a little bit about what the amendments project is? And then maybe we could talk a little bit about how some of what you learned through that project expands the way we should understand both the successes and the failures of amendment.
Yeah, so as as was mentioned in that lovely introduction, a lot of my work really is about the asymmetry of the historical record, that we know so much about some people and so little about other people. And just strikingly, nowhere is that more true than in the historical record as it is construed by the US Supreme Court. For the court, the historical record, which the court is fascinated by the 18th century, but its understanding of the historical record is just an incredibly shrunken, bounded thing. I mean, they're beautiful documents, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, the notes of the ratifying convention. They're hugely important, of soaring importance, and they're fascinating and of course apt in every way. But from the vantage of a historian who works with the large sweep of American history and the experience of many different kinds of people and individuals and groups, they're just like a vanishingly small oddity, you know? So I've thought a lot about how strange that is and how unlike historical reasoning and standards of historical evidence that the court's current way of thinking about the historical record is. I really sort of like, well, what about what everybody else wanted? And especially people that couldn't even vote for people to go to ratifying conventions in the States, say. Because there actually has been a lot of historical scholarship about what sometimes historians call the people out of doors, or they were called even at the time the people out of doors. Like people who would gather around Carpenter's Hall, like who would just be, you know, they're in there writing our new government, like people would just go out and hang out and be difficult around the building. And a lot of people would send in letters and protests and to their ratifying conventions, or send in petitions of complaint, or propose formal amendments in the states. And there is just a quite lively, unruly, just font of agitation, of constitutional agitation, both in the moment, you know, beginning in 1776 when the states are writing. Like 3,000 people gather in Philadelphia to say, isn't it great, we're going to have a constitutional convention to write a state constitution. Like, it's this huge celebration. Everyone gets drunk again. There's a lot of drinking and a lot of arguing about how the government should work. And I just kind of puzzled as a citizen by why that history is not part of how we decide what the meaning of the Constitution is. And I think, you know, someone who has that judicial philosophy could defend it, but they can't defend it as history. So I started this project partly because I really wanted a new body of evidence to work with it within my students in teaching. It turned out when I would ask students who were like, I want to do some research on, you know, efforts to insert the word God into the U.S. Constitution, and it would be almost impossible to do. There was no central place to go look to see who has ever tried to do that, when and why, and what happened to those efforts. So I got this wonderfully generous grant from the erstwhile National Endowment for the Humanities, to work with undergraduates for, I think it was like a 5-year project to collect and digitize and tag by topic every meaningful attempt to amend the U.S. Constitution, including petitions submitted to Congress, you know, letters, social media posts, sort of, you know, anything that we could find. And it was really illuminating, but it even the way we defined what a possible, like a meaningfully proposed amendment was, even that bar was kind of too high for me, because I felt that it was impossible to really put in. So for instance, you may know that right after Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, it was published and printed, and people celebrated all over the United States and read it out loud, and, you know, shot darts at pictures of the king, and like it was really fun, and they drank a lot. But there was, for instance, this black minister in Connecticut, Lemuel Haynes, wrote a response called Liberty Further Extended, which is an extended reflection on the Declaration of Independence and its failure to end slavery, and the intellectual and moral inconsistency of the document. In my mind, it is essentially, that tract is essentially a proposed amendment to the Declaration of Independence, which has become constitutionalized. And yet, it's not like anyone in the Supreme Court's ever going to cite Liberty Further Extended. And yet, nor is it even in the amendments project, because it doesn't sort of meet my bar. It's before the Constitution. It's not it's not addressed to a specific state constitution either. But I think that if we want a richer, fuller, more democratic constitutionalism in the present, we actually need to have it in the past. And I don't think we actually have had that, because so much of the story that we tell ourselves as a nation about the Constitution is essentially the story of a series of Supreme Court decisions.
And that is definitely an impoverished and inaccurate way to understand the Constitution, is just by reading Supreme Court opinions, but I am going to ask about a couple if that's okay. And you did mention the Supreme Court, and I think this does tie to the amendments project. So I thought I would ask about the 14th Amendment, which is ratified in 1868. It is the middle of the 3 amendments that are added in the 5 years between 1865 and 1870. So the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th has a bunch of components, which we'll talk about. And the 15th, prohibits racial discrimination in voting. So the 14th has been at the center of a number of Supreme Court cases, both recently and upcoming. So in just last year, in Trump versus Anderson, the Supreme Court, that case involves the 3rd section of the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies office holders who have engaged in insurrection from, again, holding office. And the Supreme Court held that the state of Colorado couldn't keep then candidate Trump off of the presidential ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. That's 2024. In 2023, the Supreme Court held that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibited universities from considering race in higher education admissions. I think the court encountered but did not reach the merits of the constitutionality of the Day 1 executive order purporting to end birthright citizenship. But I think in the next year or so, the court is likely to have to answer the question of whether the Constitution permits the president through executive order to end birthright citizenship. So that is just, like a sampling of things this Supreme Court has done in recent years, or I think will soon do. And so, Jill, you write that, and again, this ties back to the Amendments Project, that the roots of the 14th Amendment lie not in the halls of Congress, but meetings in cities and states, state constitutional conventions, so-called colored conventions. So can you just say a few words about what is that fuller picture of the origins of this incredibly important, maybe the most important constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment? And, it would probably take too long to go deep on all of this, but I guess what would a fuller, better understanding of the 14th Amendment mean in cases like the ones I just mentioned, or in general when it comes to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment?
Yeah, the 14th Amendment is so important. It's like a whole new constitution. And it was really thought about that way at the time. There were writers who said, after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, well, we'll stop celebrating 1776 as a country because we should just celebrate 1868. Like, this is actually the founding of the country. Like, it was an incomplete founding in 1776 or 1787, but this is our second founding, our new founding. And I think a lot of historians, in fact, legal scholars, also think about the 39th Congress that drafted the 14th Amendment in 1865 as essentially a constitutional convention. So there's a really kind of almost like when you renew your wedding vows somehow, but you've been married for long enough that it's a really deeper, different kind of experience. And the people who are there with you to celebrate it are richer, deeper friends that you've had for many seasons of your life. There's a kind of that feel to the 14th Amendment. It's just like a transcendent
But you're
thing.
also divorcing the original Constitution in a really profound way. So we have to complicate it a little bit.
It actually raises an interesting question. This is a diversion, but I promise I'm going to get back to the origin of the 14th Amendment. When the first amendments were proposed, which became our Bill of Rights, there was a big debate in Congress about what to do with them, because a lot of people thought you should go back in and edit the Constitution and scratch out the things that the Bill of Rights negate. And other people are like, no, that'll be so messy, we should just put them at the end and we'll just call it something else. This will be like the list of the amendments. And so they also thought, well, we'll call it the Bill of Rights, and then people will shut up about it or something. But there was a huge debate, and it really would have been very different if you think about it. There also was like a printing cost problem. People are like, we already printed so many copies of this thing. Now we have to go, and then people are going to have 2 different versions. But then the lawyerly people who were not so worried about costs were like, yeah, but as a lawyer, what if I have like Article 3 is contradicted by Amendment 4? How do I? It's going to lead to all kinds of problems of interpretation in the future, which was true. But if the 14th Amendment, if the decision had been to edit the original Constitution and then release a revised version, the 14th Amendment would have overwritten quite a bit of it. But the debate about where the 14th Amendment comes from and what it means based on what it meant at the time is like probably the biggest constitutional matter of disputation in the last 100 years, certainly since Brown v. Board of Education, where the debate in Brown v. Board of Education, when it was argued and re-argued, was like, what did they mean by the 14th Amendment? You, the NAACP, are saying the 14th Amendment was intended to prohibit segregation, but you, all of the segregated schools, are saying it was intended to prohibit no such thing. Who has the better historical evidence? And that's why it was re-argued. And then Earl Warren says, your historical evidence is completely inconclusive. Here's the thing, it's wrong. Segregation is just wrong, and we're going to end it. That was a different moment in judicial history. But in any rate, that was a really important moment because it was like the history, Warren saying, it's not that the history doesn't matter, but like we can't find answers in the past or we'll be trapped, we'll be shackled to the past. So my point, though, in my analysis of the 14th Amendment is even then, when they had assigned all these people, please go all over the country, scour the evidence, find out what they meant, no one looked at the records of the black conventions, which were constitutional conventions held by black men, more than 200 of them across the free states, starting in 1828, 1829, in which black men got together. They had state conventions, they had national conventions, they had regional conventions. They gave speeches, they raised toasts. I'm sure some of them drank, many of them drank. They published their proceedings, and they argued about the Constitution. And those are just, they have no place in our history of the Constitution. Like, bizarrely, like there's some fantastic research on these. There's a great website called the Colored Conventions Project that has collected a transcription of all the proceedings and has quite a bit of details about it. It's not like these sources are not available to the courts or even, to law schools where we're teaching constitutional history. It's just that the speeches and writings and gatherings and conventions of black Americans were not constitutionalized. I would argue they were constitutionalized. That is what the 14th Amendment is, right? Like that, those are the origins of the 14th Amendment. And is it a big secret? It's not. They're printed. Like you can read about them in any newspaper of the day. So if we can't see that, then the 14th Amendment just is far more mysterious than it is required to be.
So there's so much more I want to ask you on that, but I want to make sure to cover a bit more of what is in the book. So after the Reconstruction Amendments, you have a long period of no amendments to the Constitution. And then you have this surge between 1913 and 1920. So you have the income tax amendment, you have direct election of senators, right? Originally it was just state legislatures that pick senators. Not until the 17th Amendment do senators get directly elected. Prohibition, the 19th Amendment, right, guaranteeing the right to vote for women. So there's that kind of flurry of activity. And then there is another break, although not nearly as long as the break that precedes that kind of cluster of amendments. But actually, after that 1920 passes, you have, and this is again, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to the United States Supreme Court because it really is such an important player and often villain in the story that you are telling. So the effort to do a child labor amendment, which if you're like, wait, which amendment is that? No, so that one never makes it, but it comes really close. And I guess maybe, do you want to talk about what the impetus is to amend the Constitution, right, to prohibit child labor or to make clear that Congress can do so? And sort of what the failure tells us, and that I think maybe will bring us up to kind of FDR and the New Deal, which is of course a really important part of the story you tell.
Yeah, so if you think about that set of 4 amendments that are ratified between 1913 and 1920, they're all ones that people had been fighting for decades. It takes decades and decades and decades to get any of them through, but they're all in different ways an attempt to address the problems of the industrial economy and the political powerlessness of the poor and of women and children. And they're all attempts to remedy that. So, right, the income tax amendment is just about the poor, just getting rid of tariffs and taxing income in a graduated way so that the plutocrats will have to pay to support what is becoming, some social welfare provisions. The direct election of the Senate, right, just try to enfranchise people to have more of a control of their own lives. The prohibition, however bad an idea it was really a feminist agenda, which was a way to stop the abuse of women and children by men who could not work because they drank all day. It really was an attempt to protect women and children from drunken husbands. And from domestic violence, which was really and remains very associated with alcoholism. So it was a women's campaign, and it was a feminist campaign. And the granting women the right to vote, the argument always had to be made, this will be good because women will be able to protect children. And so the whole package really is about the weak and the poor, the politically weak and the economically poor. And child labor was the natural next amendment in that sequence, also because, like the 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment, it was the only way to address a Supreme Court decision in this case too. So the Supreme Court had ruled in the 1890s that an income tax was unconstitutional. So the only way to effect it, even though Congress had already passed a law, was to get a constitutional amendment. The Supreme Court twice decided that Congress had no power to regulate or to tax prohibitively child labor. So the only way to end it was with a constitutional amendment. And it had huge public support, really widespread public support. It passed the House on the day it was introduced. There had been child labor laws and constitutional amendments in many, many states. But the advocates for the child labor amendment did not understand, because they had not, progressivism at the time was across the parties. It wasn't a political ideology per se or a partisan position. Progressives had not encountered the kind of opposition that was waged against the child labor amendment, which was this extraordinarily well-funded campaign, chiefly led by owners of southern textile mills who wanted to continue to be able to employ children in the mills, especially black children, and they just waged a very effective ground game. And this is also the beginnings of mass communication. So there's radio, newspapers, the advertising industry has emerged, and you can lie about stuff pretty well when you have mass communication. And so their big message was, especially to rural Americans, make sure to tell your state legislators not to vote to ratify this amendment, because if they do, you will no longer be able to tell your daughter to wash the dishes or your son to bring the hay in from the field. That your family farm would fall apart. It was an extraordinarily effective campaign, and it really caught progressives up short. It also ended the progressive era of constitutional amendment, and it also provided a model for later opponents of the progressive, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The progressive amendments all had a spirit of moral reform behind them. It really seemed to suggest that moral reform and social progress could not be achieved by way of constitutional amendment if moneyed interests could be mobilized so effectively against it.
Yeah. And you also sort of, you a little bit allude to this, but there is this kind of proto-Phyllis Schlafly figure, right? Mary Kilbreth.
Yes, Mary Kilbreth. I love her. She's fantastic.
I had not heard of her. Maybe I should have. But there are so many very familiar figures and storylines, and so many that are totally unfamiliar. And for me, she was one of the very unfamiliar ones.
Yeah, she's this genius conservative political operator who is dedicated. She publishes a newspaper called The Woman Patriot that is I think the subtitle is like opposed to socialism, feminism, suffragism. Then she drops suffragism after women get the vote. And like, she's just like a one-woman political movement. She's unbelievably effective, and really hardly anyone has ever written about her. She didn't leave papers anywhere. You know, there's like one senior thesis and then a brilliant dissertation, but it's kind of astonishing how someone with such political power could be so neglected. And that's sort of the other piece. Like, I'm not like resurrecting just people that I like or I agree with. I really disagree with Mary Gilbert, but like, she's a really important American who had a lot of constitutional ideas and left behind a pretty big paper trail expressing them.
Okay, so the child labor amendment, in part because of Mary Kilbreth's efforts and in part because sort of, capital using the sort of then new forms of mass communication, is just successful in mobilizing opposition. So it passes Congress, but stalls to a halt in the states at ratification. And then so I want to now sort of move forward into FDR's presidency and the New Deal. And that's a story that I felt like I understood just in somewhat different ways after reading this account. So, people are going to be varying degrees of familiar with this standoff, right, between President Roosevelt and the very conservative Supreme Court that is striking down New Deal initiative after New Deal initiative, and also at the same time invalidating lots of state efforts to regulate in ways that protect workers and consumers and families. So this very conservative Supreme Court that is hostile to progressive legislation or action, whether state or federal. And Roosevelt responds with the court packing plan, and the way the kind of story is told is, there's a bit of a standoff, and he's unsuccessful in getting this court packing plan actually through Congress, but kind of wins at the end of the day because the Supreme Court backs down. There's the switch in time that saved 9, and the court starts upholding New Deal actions in 1937. Okay, so that part of the story is familiar, probably to varying degrees to people. But there also is, in a way, Roosevelt ends up sounding kind of like the villain of this part of the story, at least the amendment story, which is essentially by deciding not to pursue formal constitutional amendment to kind of enshrine in the document the power of the federal government to do really big, important social welfare work, he relies on the Supreme Court to uphold, to bless the ability of both the president and Congress to act. And what the Supreme Court giveth, the Supreme Court can take away. And so that is sort of the beginning of the kind of de-emphasis of formal constitutional amendment in favor of this judicialization of the most important constitutional fights and settlements that we sort of engage in. So I guess, is it right that this visionary president in many ways with respect to the Constitution, right, in his Constitutional Day speech in 1937, he famously says, the Constitution is not a lawyer's contract, it's a layman's document. He urges Americans to revere the Constitution not because it is old, but because it is ever new, but ends up thwarting inadvertently our ability to actually meaningfully make change, at least through the formal amendment process. Is that a fair kind of distillation of the book's perspective on Roosevelt?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with the considerations that led him to the decision that he made. I mean, among other, so imagine it's 1935. We're still in the Depression, right? The New Deal is doing a lot of good, but we're still in a Depression. The Supreme Court starts striking down the National Recovery Act. I mean, the backbone of the New Deal has been deemed by this conservative court, the same court that had overruled child labor, essentially, is deemed unconstitutional. And his advisors say the Gallup opinion poll starts in 1935. So that actually is kind of great polling. Roosevelt's very interested in polling. And the surveys show that the public overwhelmingly supports what he's doing. And Gallup asks, like, would you support a constitutional amendment allowing for minimum wage legislation or maximum hour legislation or many of the things that Roosevelt is doing that are part of the New Deal, or federal regulation of the economy to the degree that the New Deal is doing it. And the public opinion surveys are very good. And so Roosevelt's advisors are like, let's just constitutionalize it with an amendment. Let's put through a package. Like just a few years ago, we got 4 in a few years. But Eleanor Roosevelt had been very involved in the Child Labor Act ratification battle, and therefore so had her husband. And FDR knows what kind of a force can be arrayed against constitutional amendment. And also the Child Labor Act the Child Labor Amendment wasn't then dead. It just hadn't been ratified yet, and it had by this point been 11 years. And meanwhile, children who are 9 years old are working in mills. Like, that turned out, he's like, that wasn't the right call. I'm not going to do that again. We're in the middle of a depression. It takes forever. It just takes $1 million to defeat a constitutional amendment. We have to find another way. And he knows he has this huge public support. That's not going to be enough to ratify. These people have money. It's like called the Millionaires Lobby, which was the National Manufacturers Association, which was united in its opposition to the New Deal. And so he kind of brazens it out and bullies his way through the Supreme Court, comes up with his court packing plan, and he prevails. In among the most important first things that happened is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which abolishes child labor. Like, once he gets that go-ahead from the court, once he wins that battle, the first thing he's doing is actually, I think it's kind of telling, right? Like, he manages to get Congress to end child labor, and the Supreme Court doesn't overrule it. So, yes, in that sense, and there are other historians who've argued, like FDR killed Article 5. I think the circumstances were pretty dire.
All right, so there are two more things I want to hit on very briefly. One is, so we are now in maybe the third, not maybe, I think definitely the third longest stretch that we have had without a formal constitutional amendment. I guess, the 27th Amendment in 92 is ratified in 92, but, introduced at the very beginning and is not a particularly meaningful constitutional amendment anyway. So it's really the 26th Amendment in 1971 that's the last meaningful substantive amendment to the Constitution. That you say several times in the book that when amendment becomes impossible, the risk of insurrection rises, and essentially describe the process of amendment as a way to sort of seek change without violent rupture within the sort of polity. And I don't think you're making a strong kind of monocausal claim that the failure of amendment makes it impossible for us actually to kind of live and sort of resolve our problems in a peaceful way. But I guess how correlated, or what, can you talk about the relationship between what feels like a profound moment of constitutional breakdown, maybe that's just me, that's just my feeling, but that it feels like we are in at this moment, and the fact that we seem to have lost the ability to amend the written Constitution?
Yeah, I think the Constitution changes all the time, and it's going to change because it's a very old document and there are all kinds of pressures on it. And it has within it a mechanism for change that's designed to be a peaceful method of change that makes change possible but difficult. And it turned out it's much more difficult than it was intended to be, because recall that the Constitution was written before there were political parties. And the framers did not anticipate that there would ever be political parties. So they couldn't have anticipated the kind of partisanship, even in the 19th century, the kind of sectionalism that worsened over the course of their lifetimes. And they certainly couldn't have anticipated the polarization that makes it possible for Congress to pass anything even by a simple majority. So they thought they were leaving, a door that was open, and the door's basically locked. It's slammed shut and it's locked. So someone could figure out how to pick the lock, like that could happen. But meanwhile, the Constitution is going to change. And so when it isn't amended by formal amendment, the Constitution generally changes by Supreme Court decisions. And, that works until it doesn't, because people tend to be somewhat unprincipled about the Supreme Court. They like an activist court if they like who's on the court, and they don't like an activist court when they don't like who's on the court. And so, progressives want amendments when the court is conservative, and they oppose amendments when the court is progressive. And conservatives are equally unprincipled about that. So that sort of kind of wave-like pattern, there's amendments and then the court decides. There's amendments and then the court. It's kind of been all across American history. I think this is a different moment, because the court, yes, is making those decisions and is offering up new interpretations of the Constitution, even when they disguise those novelties as restorations of old interpretations. But actually, mainly, the executive is changing the Constitution right now by fiat, by declaration, by dictate. And that there's no provision for that in our Constitution whatsoever. And there's no check against that except for the Supreme Court, which hasn't exercised much of a check lately. I mean, we shall see there. But I think what we're witnessing is among the costs of our, I would say most Americans don't know that it's possible to amend the Constitution.
Well, young people were not, people were not even alive the last time we meaningfully did it,
yeah,
right? 1971.
Whatever. I was 4 years old, so I didn't remember that. And some people remember the defeat of the ERA, but it's just not a thing that we talk about. And maybe we shouldn't. Like, I don't know that it's something that we could or should be doing right now. I actually trying to sort of, the book isn't an argument for amendment or for holding a constitutional convention. It's really not an argument for anything except having a better history.
Yeah. So maybe I'll ask one more question and then we'll go to the crowd, because so if you said the door is locked and picking it is maybe the best we could hope for, the Supreme Court remains the kind of final arbiter, for better or worse, of executive power and essentially everything else. And so the book is, particularly in the last quarter or third, very critical of the ascent of originalism, right? The kind of sort of quasi history practiced by a majority of justices on the current Supreme Court. And it does link the kind of end of meaningful amendment to the Constitution. So in 71, we have the 26th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote for people 18 and over, and also almost get across the finish line with an amendment abolishing the Electoral College, right? That is this kind of like tragic chapter in the book with Birch Bayh, the senator who did actually successfully get the 25th and 26th done, but not the abolition of the college. So that coincides in time with the ascent of originalism, as the early ascent, at least, of originalism as a method. And you do think those two things are connected. So can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe if the book is not going to be a roadmap for reviving amendment because it's just so hard in the current polity, maybe there are things that could speak to the originalists on the current court that might shift things just enough to make a real difference.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's important, I think, to reveal about originalism is that it is, yes, a judicial philosophy that has developed in good faith by people who are principled actors, and I don't in any way mean to demean or question their principles, but it is also a political product of a political moment, and it is also a product of conservatives' failure to democratically win constitutional amendment. So if you think about what happened, in 1954 after Brown v. Board of Education, since then, most attempts to amend the Constitution have come from conservatives, beginning with proposed amendments to overturn Brown v. Board of Education. A lot of constitutional amendments, because amendment is the people's ability to check the power of the Supreme Court. They wanted to overturn Brown v. Board of Education. In the 1960s, there was a nearly successful move to call for a constitutional convention to overturn the one man, one vote redistricting decisions of the Supreme Court. Even before Roe was decided, but certainly immediately after Roe was decided in 1973, a large number of proposed amendments to overturn Roe versus Wade. And in the 1970s, when the ERA failed, it then became pretty clear that the constitutional amendment just was not going to work, no matter who was going to be bringing a constitutional amendment to bear. Because Phyllis Schlafly's campaign to stop the ERA just revealed, as the child labor defeat had revealed in the 20s and 30s, that amendment, the door had basically slammed shut. And so fiscal and social conservatives, are defeated in amending the Constitution. They can't exercise Article 5, but they have, since the rise of the Warren Court, been indicting judicial activism. So they complain all the time that the court is legislating from the bench. They are amending the Constitution by judicial decision. So legal conservatives can't say, we need to get on the court and start changing the Constitution because we can't use Article 5 because we don't have the votes and because Article 5 is basically defunct. So they come up with a different strategies, like we need to get on the court and we're going to not change the Constitution, we're going to restore it to its original meaning. And it's a very brilliant rhetorical move, honestly, as a kind of political strategy. And it begins to be implemented. In the term originalism is coined in 1980. It begins to be implemented in 1982 with Reagan's Justice Department. Edwin Meese makes originalism the official policy of the Justice Department. Any judge nominated to the federal judiciary has to pass an originalist litmus test. This is all done in the ramp up to 1987, which is the bicentennial of the Constitution. Those of you who are here may remember the We the People parade in Philadelphia. Reagan came to speak. Mickey and Minnie had a big parade in Florida. So that bicentennial constitutional moment, which happens to also be when Robert Bork is in the hearings before the Judiciary Committee promoting originalism, and although he was defeated, originalism certainly prevailed. So I just think it's actually kind of important to lay out that history, because the idea that originalism is not judicial activism, that's not really a defensible proposition. I'm sorry, it's not defensible. But the idea that it is more democratic as a means of judicial interpretation, I think that is defied by the historical record. So, it is many things, and there are many different people who subscribe to many different varieties of originalism, but it is not original to the Constitution.
All right, I think I can take a couple of questions from the crowd. There are a couple of microphones that I believe are making their way down. We've got questions in the front. Yes, please, go ahead. Oh, no, you're holding the mic. You're not going to ask a question. Sorry, you're handing off the mic? Okay. Well, if you have, you had a hand down here? Yeah, please, the young lady in the front row.
Oh,
Yes, we
it
got
is
you.
on.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Good evening. This has been so fascinating. I really, really appreciate it. I'm a huge fan of you both. As a constitutional law professor, I really appreciate what you both said about the courts. I think, Jill, you call it bounded understanding. I think, Kate, you called it impoverished understanding of constitutional history. And when we're operating in a context in which amendments, the kind of democratic process for changing our Constitution, is unavailable, and we are dependent on judicial interpretation for constitutional change, and we do know that there is an ascendant originalist view, but even if we were not beholden to originalism, we still always start with kind of constitutional history in our interpretive approach. But part of the problem is that our Supreme Court does it so poorly. And so I'm wondering if you, as a historian, can give our justices some sort of standard that they can adopt from the disciplinary rigor of a historian for how to do history better, so that it's not so bounded, so that it's not so impoverished. So if this is our only mechanism for doing this, we have a fuller understanding of, even if we're going to start with the question of what the Constitution originally meant, right? There's a much broader view, right? And not cherry picking, not kind of, just determining what you want it to mean, but literally understanding the very broad view of history. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I guess I don't think that the courts, the justices and judges who are originalists, are doing history. So if I thought they were doing history, then maybe there's a way to do it better. I think they sometimes claim to be doing history, but they're not. It's something else. I think for most scholars of history, it's not recognizable. It doesn't use historical methods. It doesn't abide by our rules of evidence. It's just quite an unusual thing. Someone asked me the same question the other day, and I came up with an explanation that I like, so I'm going to recycle it, which was, I was like, because they're like, what do you mean they're not doing history? I'm like, they are looking at old documents and they're interpreting them. If I were a chemist, and there were some chemists that, when they looked at the periodic table, they said, I'm only interested in the first two columns, I would not think they were also chemists in the way that I'm a chemist. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what I mean by the impoverished. So I could say, oh, I wish that you would look at the rest of the periodic table. But they're alchemists. You know what I mean? Like, they're doing something like I work in a lab and I have beakers and there are burners, and and they are doing magic. Like, it's just really not recognizable. So I think it's almost kind of a challenge to figure out how to bridge that gap. I mean, I started teaching at the law school a few years ago at my institution because I'm fascinated. I teach a course called The History of Evidence, where I look at the rules of evidence in different realms because I have exactly the same questions you, like, how can people think this is a way that you could say, and I've been involved, I read the historians' briefs in these major cases, and I've written one, and I've signed one, and then the ruling comes down, and you read the opinion, you're like, what were they looking at? Like, the historical record is this huge thing, and they found this weird, like, 4 sentences and some, like, and you're just like, how did that happen? So partly I teach at the law school because I'm learning so much from my colleagues about what different modes of reasoning and how doctrines work and what are political questions. I don't know. I find this fascinating, but it's totally foreign to how a historian works. So I'm not sure. I mean, I for sure wrote the book with an eye to, like, maybe some lawyers will read it and they'll be like, oh, it turns out the Constitution has a richer history than I knew. I didn't learn this in law school. But I'm not sure it goes any way towards solving the problem.
Yeah, the question right there, a couple rows back. Thanks.
I'm wondering if the length of time justices have served in the past as compared to now, since our lifespans are greater and they seem to be getting younger, whether that creates a static court, and if there's a mechanism to reinvigorate that by changing either the cycle, something, so that you don't have the same people sitting there for 20 years doing the same thing.
Yeah, this has been a kind of evergreen across American history as a matter of dispute. And as you know, a lot of states have very different rules for their state courts. And although many of them started out in the same place the US Constitution started out, they revised their constitutions in the 19th century. I think 2 things. First of all, Supreme Court appointments shouldn't matter anywhere near as much as they do. They matter this much because the court has more power than it should have, and the court has more power than it should have because there is no ability to amend the Constitution. So it wasn't until 1939 that any nominee to the Supreme Court was even ever brought before the Senate Judiciary Committee. They were just like, okay, fine, you want to put this person on? And then, there were a couple people who were brought in to ask one question. And it was just this weird technical thing that happened in Washington. No one ever even heard about it. The idea that the public has an interest in who the president names to the court, you don't even see that until the late 1960s with Nixon's appointees who are segregationists, and there's a big campaign in the Senate against them. But I think Bork's is the first televised, maybe Scalia's is the first televised hearing, but Bork's is certainly the first where there is an ad campaign run against a Supreme Court candidate. And if you think of the craziness of the Kavanaugh hearing or the Thomas hearing, those are the products of a deformity of our constitutional separation of powers. It shouldn't matter that much. We shouldn't know things about the wives or spouses of people who sit on the Supreme Court. They shouldn't fear for their lives. This is wrong. Their personalities, their private lives should not be the subject of scrutiny of ordinary people. That is a deformity of our constitutional system. So I agree with you that you're exactly right, and quantitatively right. People live longer, often they're appointed younger. This was part of, the court packing plan was about a mandatory sort of junior JV status once you reach 70. You could sort of still keep your job, but you couldn't vote anymore. But there have been many, many, many proposals to reform the court. One of the most of them date to the progressive era, and I sometimes put these up on a screen and ask people if they support them. One of them was, if you're going to overturn a law passed by Congress, which is a power of the court that is disputed in many circles, you have to have a 7-2 majority at a minimum. There are a lot of ideas, not just term limits or age limits, or appointing more judges to the courts. There are a lot of other constraints that Americans have sought on the courts. None of them made any significant headway, nor are any particularly likely to. And I think, in a way, it's a bit of a mistake to think that we could solve that problem in isolation. Right. Congress is useless, the president is becoming a tyrant, and the Supreme Court has too much power. You can't just fix one of those things.
Well, that's too grim a note to end on. So we have to have one more question from the audience. I can't really see hands in the back, but yes, if you can see one back there, please.
Do you have a different answer to that important question? You're on it with the court.
No, I think that you're right that the combination of an unamendable constitution, an all-powerful and life-tenured court is an intolerable combination, and all-powerful executive and kind of complacent Congress. I think you're right that a full package is required. I tend to say court reform in isolation won't do much. Court reform is part of a larger democratic reform that doesn't necessarily mean Article 5 amendment, but meaningful reform of democracy. Senate is an enormous problem, but probably can't be amended anyway. But I think that democracy reform that has court reform as a component, I think could actually go a long way toward addressing our current predicament. But sorry, last question.
So I'm just wondering, where will the historical evidence record be with this packet court decisions where we get absolutely no reasoning behind these decisions?
You're talking about the shadow docket. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, some of those we will eventually find out. One of the things that's really interesting about the court is that it is not subject, this is a little bit to one side, to the same, like the Federal Records Act. Like when Congress passed the Presidential Records Act after Watergate, which requires the president to turn over the records of her or his administration to the National Archives, the same applies to Congress. So those two branches of government have obligations to preserve records, but the Supreme Court has eluded that. The Judicial Records Act doesn't cover the personal papers of Supreme Court justices. I once wrote a long New Yorker piece called The Great Paper Caper about how many Supreme Court justices' papers go missing. They often burn them. Very often they burn them. If they give them to an archive, they often keep them sealed for 100 years. In other words, I think, the shadow or the interim docket is in some ways the least of the problems of record keeping. It is the fact that when you leave the Supreme Court, you are at complete liberty to destroy all your records of your service on the court. Okay, wait, that was not the positive note. I forgot. Okay, here's a positive note. Most of the justices don't destroy them.
I don't know how to land this plane in a more uplifting way, except to say that I think that you're selling the book short when you say it's going to not necessarily break through something on the bench or with law clerks, and at least even if they're not going to start doing something that is recognizably history, like I think you made a convincing case that the periodic table, that is amazing. I'm going to borrow that and I will credit you. But that they cannot, I think, ignore the sort of wealth of additional information that you bring to bear on some of these big questions. And so I at least hope that this kind of really careful work does, even if it takes a while. One of the lessons of the book is decades and decades and decades later, you sort of see the fruits of your labor, that this sort of thing, I can imagine, at least in terms of methodology, having some impact down the line. So that is my attempt to end us on a more uplifting note.
Thanks so much, everyone, and thank you,
so
Kate.
much.